Today we're going to look at a resource management exam question for GCSE Geography. The question is, to what extent is it preferable to source food locally in the UK rather than import it from abroad? This is a 6-mark question. Remember that before you start answering the question, to highlight the key words so that you understand what is required of you. So this question is asking you to make a judgment because it's saying to what extent. So by the end of your answer, you need to say to a large extent, to a small extent, sourcing food locally is better than sourcing it from abroad, and you need to give some reasons for it if that is the case. So before you start answering this question, as you're revising, make sure that you get your textbook out, get your notes out to make some bullet points down before you start answering the question. This will form really good revision for you. So you might want to write down maybe 1 or 2 arguments for sourcing food locally, some arguments against sourcing food locally. You might want to put some data in, some statistics in, for example, and then you might want to do some arguments for sourcing food from abroad and some arguments for not sourcing food from abroad, so some arguments against it. And when you've written down 2 bullet points, say, for each one of these sections, then you can make your own overall judgment at the end. So that will be a very brief line explaining your position on whether food should be sourced locally or from abroad in your opinion and why. Let's have a look at some answers. It is significantly more preferable to source food locally in the UK. This is due to food being a lot fresher and normally a lot higher in quality. So the candidate here hasn't really talked much about some details regarding local food sources, hasn't given any examples, hasn't really explained what makes local food more fresher or higher in quality, hasn't validated those points. Also, the candidate has not talked about anything about the food being imported from abroad, some positives or negatives of that. If you wrote this simply in the exam, a simple 1-line sentence, you're not going to get many marks. So this probably will be a very low level mark answer, maybe 1 at the most. Let's have a look at another answer. It is largely preferable to source food locally because shipping from abroad, even if food's nicer and more exotic, it's more expensive and leaves a large carbon footprint as they'll have to transport food from across the world, usually burning and leaving CO2 in the atmosphere at the same time, which contributes to global warming. So the candidate started off with the first few lines talking about the sourcing food locally is preferable, with the argument that sourcing it from abroad is very expensive and causes large footprints. This is an absolutely valid point to make and well qualified, although it would have been perhaps better start off by talking about what makes local food preferable rather than talking about the disadvantages of sourcing food from abroad. Locally is better as it's less cheap and leaves a little to no carbon footprint as they source the food to their local supermarket. You've got to be a little bit careful in the exam, especially when you're writing out sentences, that what you're writing is making sense. Often we are rushing in the exams because we're trying to get everything that we know down. But if you take the time to just annotate the question, it gives your mind that breathing space and it will improve the quality of what you write as well. Let's carry on with the paragraph. They'll also get more money as more people buy their food, so more people will see farming as a good source of income, so more green lands and farmlands will be created, which helps the environment. So the candidate here had an opportunity to talk about locally sourced foods. He or she has suggested how local food is better because there is a smaller carbon footprint. But um, the argument about less cheap food is a little bit unclear, and the idea that people will get more money, um, well, the supermarkets will get more money as people buy food locally, is um, an economic reason for that's being suggested here, which could be better written out in this answer. The ideas about greenlands and farmlands is very vague, although it would be better here to qualify that with perhaps an example in your answer. So in this answer overall, there are some areas where the candidate has identified some absolutely valid points, but then at other points has been a little bit unclear about the benefits of sourcing food locally. So overall, this probably would be a mid-band answer, maybe 3 and maybe 4 marks if the examiner is being generous. Let's have a look at the next answer. Locally sourced food is preferable over imported food to a large extent. So the candidate is starting with a judgment, which I wouldn't recommend doing because it then sets the premise for the rest of your argument. What you want to do is look at different arguments and then come to a judgment at the end. So you're informing the examiner of your knowledge about the issue rather than saying to the examiner, this is the only answer. Locally sourced foods have lower food miles than food from abroad, and so contribute less to our carbon footprints. A valid statement to make. Good use of geographical terminology such as food miles and carbon footprints. This helps reduce the effect of climate change. That statement is a little bit vague, although it's developing on the previous point. It also helps support local businesses. So here, again, the candidate could explain this in a bit more detail, what they mean by supporting local businesses. However, locally sourced food can after be expensive because people in the UK demand higher wages than workers in countries abroad. For example, banana growers in Africa earn less than 50% of what workers in the UK earn from agriculture. So here the candidate is making a valid point about the expense involved in creating locally sourced food in the UK. It's absolutely valid to say that the cost of production per unit probably are going to be higher in the UK in comparison to a developing country. Overall, food sourced locally is preferable to food from abroad because it reduces our CO2 emissions, but on the other hand, they often cost more, which isn't always affordable for poorer people. So the candidate has come to a conclusion and has referred back to the original question, which is a good way to answer this question overall. And it's basically balancing out the arguments for and against in the final sentences. This is a really good way to end a to what extent answer. Overall, this probably would be top level, mid band, or maybe just encroach into a top band answer. So maybe 4 or 5 out of 6. So look at another answer. Sourcing food locally in the UK brings many advantages. For example, the reduction in food miles decreases the carbon dioxide emissions of the food's transport, reducing its effect on global warming. So the candidate here has explained or has set the scene for the paragraph, first of all, talking about the advantages, and talks about how that is happening through reduction of food miles and carbon dioxide emissions, and how it's being reduced in terms of its transportation. Sourcing food locally also means money goes to farmers, increasing their profits and contributions to the economy. This is a valid point to make, and the candidate is referring specifically to things economically that are improving the welfare of the businesses and farmers involved. However, sourcing food locally has many disadvantages as well. A very good sentence to start with because it sets the scene for what the paragraph or sentences that will follow will be about. Many crops cannot be grown in the UK's climate without the use of greenhouses, which often use more energy and release more CO2 than simply importing food from a warmer country. Food grown in the UK is often more expensive than imported from abroad. So the candidate here is talking about the fact that there are certain foods that are not within the seasonal climate of the UK, and therefore they have to be imported from abroad. This is a valid point to make and could be improved further with the candidate talking about why it's often more expensive than imported food. In conclusion, to a large extent, growing food locally is preferable to foreign imports. However, imports are still preferable for certain foods which the UK climate is not suitable for growing. This is a good way to conclude or come to a judgment at the end because the question is asking to what extent, and the candidate has balanced their thoughts at the end, which shows that they understand or appreciate that there are multiple ways to look at this. However, perhaps sourcing food locally is preferable, although it's not entirely completely possible. So this would be a top band answer. Um, at worst, it would be 4 out of 6, but probably be 5 or more in the exam. So in terms of what the mark scheme is looking for this answer, the breakdown is as follows. So 1 mark for the basic statement, farmers can make more profit or some idea of profitability. The idea that it goes straight from the farm locally to someone's plate further a few miles away, and it allows producers and supermarkets to therefore reduce their costs and maximize their profits. There could be some argument that the food is cheaper because there are less transportation miles involved, although there are some challenges to that. And of course, if we're sourcing food locally, then it will obviously reduce our imports for those specific items. So 2 marks for a developed idea. So large farms have taken over smaller ones, so they can reduce the costs in order in using machinery across a wider area to increase profits, something that often candidates don't refer to. Supermarkets and large growing organizations such as World or Produce World have prospered as they control every stage from growing to final sale and don't lose money to any middlemen. So this could be another argument that a candidate could write in the exam. There are 4 major agricultural companies in the world which control the entirety of the world's food supply. So in effect, they become very, very efficient in producing and delivering food to people from around the world. The reduced cost of production means prices can be kept lower, so food prices are lower in real terms than 30. I'm not sure what that's referring to, but overall, there are going to be reduced costs of production if it's being mass produced, particularly in developing countries, and that can help to reduce the costs of food production. So, hopefully this has been a helpful guide for you to write your own answer to this question. Remember to outline the key points, a couple of bullet points, go back to this video and complete the table. This will form really good revision for you, but also help you to structure your answer. And then have a look at those sample answers in the latter half of this video in the way that they've started their paragraphs and particularly how they've ended it, and try to replicate how they're writing in your own writing style. And remember, it's got to be in your own writing style because uh, only you know how to write the way that you write, and you just need to adapt your writing so that you are conveying to the examiner that you understand what the issues are. Remember, for the conclusion, we've looked at a couple of the last two examples. They were really good in the way that they were balancing their thoughts on the answer. So you may want to start with a sentence such as, overall, I think that to a small or large extent it is preferable to X or Y, say your position, and then use those previous examples to construct your own version of a balanced conclusion. Remember, you're going to keep on practicing. Your exams are not too far away now, only a few weeks away, and the best thing for you to do, as always, is to do exam questions as regularly as possible. The more that you'll do, the better you'll get at writing, and that is going to be the best way for you to perform the exam itself. Any questions? Let me know in the chat now. Give you guys 30 seconds or so, a minute. If not, then tomorrow we will also have another session. I'll upload that onto the channel very shortly, and I hope to see you there. See you tomorrow.